So today we're going to talk some more about edge sharpness on long swords. We're going to use our example of the Schloss Airbox sword here and look at some of the details of it pretty minutely. There will be a table of measurements in the blog post. There should be a link in the description of this video. And it'll talk about where we have measured in intervals down the blade every 2 inches from the guard to the tip, giving the width, the thickness. So here I want to define what I'm looking at and measuring in the 2 different angle measurements I provide in the graph. The angle of blade surfaces is measuring the main angles of a diamond section blade that come together. So I'm measuring what the majority of this edge is to this edge. Now, most medieval blades will have a tendency to be worn and may start a little narrower, come out to the original or close to it, and then come back in after sharpening. The angle of edge is much more this portion that we're going to measure. We're trying to get in here, and it's pretty difficult in some places to really get an accurate measurement, but we're trying to get an idea of what this angle right here is as it comes down to meeting the 2 surfaces. To get an average idea of where these points are on this blade in a lot of different areas, because it changes continually throughout the blade itself. It starts out just a little bit under a 1/4 inch thick and travels down relatively evenly, but it does have some plateaus and areas where it kind of varies in the taper. The width, you can see, obviously has a few places of larger wear or more wear on the edge, and that will affect some of this as well. But the angle of that edge, the sharpness of the sword, is something that when we look at a medieval sword like this, it can really inform us that a sword like this, which is probably representing a decently used sword but not worn out or anything, has not an exact angle to it. The angle on this sword varies right at the edge from like 19 degrees all the way up to somewhere in the 26, maybe even 27 range, and then back down again in different parts. So you're seeing measurements of 26.2, 19, 21, 20, 22, 18, all the way along the sword. So there is no like set angle for the sharpness of this sword. Now, a modern sword made today, when you look at it side by side, you will see oftentimes that it does have a very set angle. Sometimes people will think this secondary bevel will kind of have a exactness to it. But in the case of a medieval sword sharpened by hand, it probably did not. When you're sharpening the sword itself, whether you're using stones or you're using a belt or a grinder, you're going to be using that blade and moving it along that cutting surface in some way, or moving the grinder along the cutting surface. And if it's held by hand and not set in jigs and things like that, then that's going to have some hand variation in it. Now, does that make it less sharp? Not at all. It's the point where those 2 edges come together, making sure there's no burrs, making sure there's no foldovers, those kind of things that really creates that edge. As those convex edges come down to that angle from the flatter angle of the body of the blade, that's where you really get the meat behind your edge and you create the sharpness for your sword. So when we've looked at these swords, understanding that it's a hand process, you're involved with a lot of different attributes happening in the characteristics of the blade, how the blade edges come together, the construction of the blade itself. All of those things are factors in that finishing of a medieval sword. And as we look back at some of the other episodes we've talked about finishing of the medieval sword, you can see there's a great variation in aspects of the quality of the finish, who's doing the work, how the intended purpose of the sword. All of those things factor into it to create the right sword for the customer at that time. Today we try and replicate those things here at Arms and Armor. We do a replica of the Schloss Airbox sword that is pretty popular and one that works very well for cutting and using in practice and things like that. But that goes into all of our swords, where we strive to look at the original pieces, strive to get a sense of what that original sword would have been like, and to approach that level of finish and ideas and design all in a piece that is affordable today.